The city breathed in the cold. It was a deep, damp chill that seeped through layers of clothing and settled in the bones. It smelled of exhaust fumes, wet concrete, and the distant, greasy promise of food from 100 different kitchens. She moved through the evening crowds, a silent figure in a too thin jacket. Its color faded from a forgotten blue to a muddy gray. Her name was Alara, though she hadn't heard anyone say it in a long time. To the world, she was just another piece of the urban scenery, glanced at and then quickly forgotten at her feet. Wrapped in worn-out sneakers that had absorbed every puddle of the day, carried her with a tired rhythm. The backpack on her shoulders held her entire life. It wasn't much. A spare pair of socks rolled tight, a water bottle half full, a small, soft cloth bundle containing a hairbrush and a few precious personal things. And tucked right at the bottom, wrapped in a plastic bag to keep it safe from the damp, was a heavy, thick book of sheet music. Its pages were soft with age, the corners bent from years of love. Alara's stomach was a tight knot of emptiness. It had been a day of quiet rejections. A mumbled no at the back door of a bakery. A shake of the head from a construction foreman who needed no extra help. She had hands, she had strength. She was willing to work for a meal. That was all she wanted. Not spare change, not pity. Just a fair trade dot as she turned a corner. A different kind of warmth hit her. Not from a heater or a fire, but from golden light spilling out of large, clean windows. It was a bistro called the Gilded Plate. Through the glass, she could see a world of soft laughter, of people leaning close over flickering candles, of steam rising from beautiful plates of food. The air around the door, when she pushed it open a crack, carried the rich, savory scent of garlic, herbs, and roasting meat. It was so powerful it made her head swim for a second. Her entrance didn't cause a scene. A few people at the tables nearest the door glanced up. Their eyes took in her jacket, her backpack, the tired set of her shoulders, and then politely returned to their conversations. The contrast was sharp. Here was soft fabric, gleaming silverware, the gentle clink of wine glasses. And here she was, feeling like she was made of dust and old paper. She gathered her courage, a small, brittle thing inside her chest, and walked towards the polished wooden bar. A man in a crisp white shirt and a neat black vest was arranging glasses. He had the air of someone in charge, a careful watchfulness in his eyes. This was the manager. His name tag said Mr. Thorne. "Excuse me," Alara said. Her voice came out softer than she intended, a little rough from the cold air. Mr. Thorne looked up. His expression didn't change, but his eyes did a quick, professional sweep of her. It wasn't cruel, just coldly efficient. He saw a potential problem. "I was wondering," Alara continued, forcing the words out. "I'm looking for work. Any work at all. I can wash dishes. I can scrub floors. I can clean. I'd like to work for a hot meal." She kept her hands at her sides, willing them not to shake. She made sure to say work for. It was important. Mr. Thorne placed the glass he was holding down on the bar with a quiet, precise tap. He offered a thin, professional smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice low and firm, meant just for her, but clear enough for the people at the nearby tables to catch the tone. "We're not hiring, and our kitchen staff is fully staffed for the evening." "It wouldn't have to be official," Ilara pressed, a faint heat of desperation rising in her cheeks. "Just for tonight. An hour's work. For a bowl of soup, anything." She gestured vaguely towards the back, where she imagined the kitchen to be. "I'm a hard worker." "That's not how we operate," Mr. Thorne said, his voice growing a fraction cooler. The finality in it was like a door clicking shut. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave. You're disturbing the guests." The word disturbing hung in the air. Elara felt the eyes on her again, hotter now. She hadn't been loud. She hadn't begged. She had simply asked. But her presence, her need, was the disturbance. The humiliation was a physical thing, a flush that started at her neck and burned up to her hairline. It felt like she was shrinking, becoming smaller and more invisible, yet also painfully, glaringly visible. She nodded, not trusting herself to speak. There was no point in arguing. The world inside the gilded plate had walls she could not cross. As she turned, her gaze swept across the room one last time over the smiling faces. The elegant plates, the beautiful glow of the place, and that's when she saw it Dot in the center of the dining room. On a small raised platform was a grand piano. It was a beautiful instrument, its dark wood polished to a mirror shine, reflecting the warm light of the chandelier above. The lid was propped open, revealing the gleaming golden strings inside, waiting. The keyboard was covered with a fallboard of rich reddish wood. It looked like a sleeping creature, full of silent potential. For a second, just a heartbeat, the sight of it punched through the shame and the cold hunger. A strange, deep ache, older than the emptiness in her stomach, stirred within her. Her fingers, tucked into her pockets to keep warm, twitched involuntarily. Then the moment passed. Mr. Thorne was still watching her, waiting for her to go. The murmurs of the diners returned to their normal volume, the incident already fading from their evening. Elara pulled her jacket tighter around her, ducked her head, and stepped back out into the biting cold. The door swung shut behind her, sealing away the warmth and the light and the music that wasn't playing. The city's noises rushed back in the blare of a horn, the screech of a distant train, the constant low rumble of life moving on. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment, the bistro's glow painting a yellow rectangle on the concrete at her feet. She felt more alone than she had before she went in. Asking had made the no real. She crossed the street to a small, dark park, finding a bench under a skeletal tree. She pulled her knees up to her chest, trying to conserve warmth. From here, she could still see the bistro window, a glowing painting of a life she couldn't touch. Her breath clouded in the air. The knot in her stomach was tighter now. Twisted with rejection, Dot, she thought about the piano. It was a silly thing to focus on. What did a piano matter when you were cold and hungry? But she couldn't help it. Her mind, trying to escape the present, drifted back. She saw different hands on different keys, smaller, younger hands, under a sunlit window in a quiet, happy room. She heard a different sound, not the clatter of the city, but the clear, sure note of middle C, the foundation of everything. The memory was so vivid it was painful, a sweet and sour taste in her mouth. She didn't know how long she sat there, shivering, lost between the cold present and the warm past. She didn't see the old man inside the bistro finish his coffee and his book. She didn't see him pause to speak quietly to Mr. Thorne at the bar, his expression thoughtful. She didn't see him pull on his expensive wool coat and scarf and step out into the night. Her world had shrunk to the chill in her fingers and the hollow feeling inside her. The beautiful piano and the world it represented felt like a dream from another lifetime, completely separate from the harsh reality of the bench, the cold and the echoing no that still rang in her ears. The night stretched ahead, long and dark, and the only music would be the wind whistling through the trees. The cold was no longer just outside of her. It was inside, too. It had settled in her chest, a hard, icy weight that made every breath feel shallow. Elara sat on the park bench, her arms wrapped tight around her knees, watching the warm yellow squares of the bistro windows. People moved inside like figures in a beautiful silent film. They laughed. They leaned in to talk. They lifted forks to their mouths. It was a world behind glass, and she was on the wrong side of it. She replayed the moment in her head, again and again. The manager's face, His voice not loud, but so terribly final. The way the Guiners had looked at her, then away. Each memory was like a little stone added to the weight in her chest. She had tried. That was the thing. She had tried to do it right, to offer work, to be honest. And the no hadn't just been about food. It had been about her. About her worn jacket, her tired face, the story her very presence told. They didn't see a person willing to work. They saw a problem to be removed. A part of her wanted to just disappear into the dark of the park, to become invisible. But another part, a smaller, stubborn part, was angry. It was a hot, sharp feeling that fought against the cold inside. That anger was the only thing keeping her from folding completely. She didn't hear the footsteps at first. The sound was soft on the gravel path, muffled by the city's constant hum. It was only when a shadow fell across the ground in front of her that she flinched, pulling back instinctively. I hope I'm not intruding. The voice was gentle, older. It wasn't the voice of the manager. It wasn't sharp or impatient. She looked up slowly. A man stood there, maybe in his 70s. He was tall and thin, dressed in a heavy, well-made coat of dark wool, a scarf tucked neatly at his neck. His hair was white and carefully combed. But it was his eyes that held her. They were a pale, watery blue, and they looked at her not with pity, but with a calm, deep curiosity. He didn't smile. His expression was serious, thoughtful. Elara said nothing. She just looked at him, waiting for the other shoe to drop. Was he security? Was he going to tell her she couldn't sit here either? He didn't seem to need her to speak. He followed her earlier gaze across the street to the bistro. It's a curious thing, a piano in a place like that, he said, his tone conversational, as if they were two people simply discussing the weather. Most of the time, it's just furniture. A beautiful thing to look at. They have a student play pleasant tunes on Friday evenings, I'm told. Mostly for atmosphere. He paused, letting his words hang in the cold air. Then he turned those pale blue eyes back to her. You looked at it when you were leaving. Not at the people or the food. At the piano. A jolt went through Elara. How could he have noticed that? In that moment of sheer humiliation, how could he have seen where her eyes went? She dropped her gaze to her own hands, clenched in her lap. Her fingers were red from the cold. I have a theory, the old man continued. He moved slowly and sat on the far end of her bench, keeping a respectful distance. He didn't look at her now, but out at the street. I think an instrument knows. It knows when it's just a decoration. It suffers from the silence. It waits for someone who understands that it's not just wood in wire, that it's a vessel for everything a person can't say. His words were strange. They didn't fit the night. They were about music and feeling, not about cold and hunger and being told to leave. Elara felt confused, off balance. Why are you talking to me? She finally asked, her voice a dry whisper dotted this. He turned to face her fully. Because I saw you ask for work, and I saw you be refused. And then I saw you see the piano. He leaned forward slightly, his hands resting on a polished wooden cane she hadn't noticed before. My name is Alistair. I am or was a teacher of music for many, many years. My eyes are old, but they still see some things. A teacher. That made a strange kind of sense. He had that air about him, of listening, of assessing. It doesn't matter, Elara said, the bitterness leaking into her voice. I'm not going back in there. What if, Alistair said, his tone becoming even softer, more deliberate. You weren't going in for a meal? Or for work? She looked at him, puzzled. What if you went in for the piano? He said, that piano, specifically. It sits there night after night, mostly unheard. It's a shame. Someone should play it. truly play it, not just tinkle for background noise. He paused, watching her reaction carefully. Would you play it? The question was so absurd, so utterly unexpected, that for a second, Elara thought she had misheard. What? Would you play that piano? He repeated, as if he were asking her the time. For its sake. And if I'm being entirely honest, for the sake of an old teacher's curiosity. I have a feeling about these things. I've had it for a long time. Elara stared at him. A laugh, harsh and dry, almost escaped her. You're joking. They threw me out. That man. He won't let me back in. He thinks I'll scare his customers. A small, knowing smile touched Alistair's lips for the first time. Mr. Thorne, he said, nodding. He is a manager. He manages things. He keeps the order. But he is also a businessman. And I am a very good customer. The old man's eyes twinkled faintly. I have already spoken to him. It took a little convincing. I won't lie. But he has agreed. The bistro is closed to the public now. The last guests are leaving. The staff is finishing up. But the door will be open for you. Elara's mind was racing. It was a trick. It had to be. Some cruel joke. Go back in. Humiliate herself further. Why? Was all she could manage. Why would you do this? Alistair sighed, a soft cloud in the cold air. Perhaps because the world is full of too much silence where there should be sound. Perhaps because I am old, and I have learned that the most interesting people are often the ones the world overlooks. Or perhaps, he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, because when you looked at that piano, you didn't see a piece of furniture. You saw an old friend. And I find that interesting. He stood up, a bit stiffly, using his cane for support. There is no obligation. No trick. You can walk away right now. Go find another bench, another doorway. That is your choice. He began to turn, then stopped. But if you choose to come, you will not be going in for charity. You will be going in for a conversation. A conversation between you and a box of wood and wire that has been waiting, I suspect, for a very long time to be understood. He started to walk slowly, deliberately, back across the street towards the bistro. He didn't look back. Elara sat frozen. Her heart was pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Every instinct told her this was a bad idea. To go back to the place of her humiliation. To trust a strange old man. To even think about touching a beautiful instrument like that when her hands were cold and dirty and she hadn't played properly in years. But his words echoed. It suffers from the silence. And deeper than the hunger, deeper than the cold, deeper than the shame, was a longing. A longing for the feel of smooth ivory under her fingertips. For the weight of a pedal under her foot. For the chance to speak without words. To pour everything she couldn't say, the grief, the loneliness, the memory of warmth. The stubborn anger into something that could hold it. It was terrifying. Slowly, her limbs stiff, she uncurled herself from the bench. Her legs felt like they were made of wood. She adjusted the straps of her backpack, that familiar weight of her whole life. She looked at the bistro door. The old man, Alistair, was now standing just inside, holding the door open a crack. He was just a silhouette against the warm light. She took one step, then another. The gravel of the path crunched under her sneakers. Each step was a battle between fear and that deep, aching pull. She crossed the street, the cold wind biting at her face. She stood before the door, looking up at the old man's face. He gave a single, slight nod. No smile. Just a quiet, solemn expectation. She hesitated one last second, her hand on the cold metal of the door handle. She could still run. She could vanish into the night. But she didn't. She took a breath that shuddered all the way down to her frozen toes, pushed the door open, and stepped back into the warmth. The warmth of the bistro felt different this time. It wasn't a welcoming embrace, but a heavy, watchful silence. The main lights were dimmed, leaving only a few pools of gold falling from small lamps on the walls. The chairs were upturned on the empty tables, their legs pointing skyward like a forest of stilts. The air still smelled of good food and coffee, but underneath it was the scent of cleaning chemicals. Everyone was still there, just as the old man Alistair had said. Mr. Thorne stood behind the bar, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. He didn't look angry now, but deeply skeptical, like a scientist waiting for an experiment to fail. Two waitstaff, a young woman and a young man still in their black aprons, lingered near the kitchen door. They looked tired from their shift, but curious, their eyes wide. One of them had a phone half hidden in her hand, and there was Alistair. He had taken a seat at a small table in the corner, his coat draped over the back of his chair. He sat perfectly still, his hands folded on the table in front of him. He wasn't smiling. He just watched her with those calm, pale eyes. The grand piano sat in the middle of the room, looking larger and more majestic than ever in the semi-darkness. The polished wood seemed to drink in the dim light, glowing softly. It was a world away from the cold, gritty street just outside the door. Ilara felt every single eye on her. The weight of their stares was a physical pressure on her skin. Her mouth was dry. The familiar gnawing hunger in her stomach was still there, but it was drowned out by a wave of pure electric fear. What was she doing? This was a terrible mistake. She was a fool to have listened to the old man's strange words. She wanted to turn and run, but her feet seemed rooted to the spot. "All right?" Mr. Thorne's voice cut through the quiet. It was flat, businesslike. "You have 10 minutes. Then we need to lock up." He said it not to her, but to Alistair, as if she were just an object they were both humoring. The sound of his voice broke her paralysis. She forced her legs to move, one step, then another, across the wooden floor. Her sneakers, still damp from the street, made no sound. The journey to the piano felt like walking the length of a football field. Every step echoed in the cavernous silence of the closed restaurant. Finally, she stood before the instrument. Up close, it was even more beautiful. She could see the delicate grain of the wood, the flawless shine of the black lacquer on the keys. She reached out a hand, her fingers trembling violently. She didn't touch it. She just let her fingertips hover an inch above the fallboard. The cover that protected the keys' memories crashed over her, not as clear pictures, but as feelings. The feeling of her mother's hand on her small shoulder. The smell of old books in a sunlit room. The security of the metronome's steady tick-tock, tick-tock. A deep, homesick ache, sharper than any hunger, bloomed in her chest. She pulled her hand back as if the wood were hot. She couldn't do this. She was going to fail. She would sit down, her stiff, cold fingers would stumble, and she would make a fool of herself. They would all see the manager, the waiters, the kind old man that she was exactly what she appeared to be, just a homeless girl with a crazy idea. She glanced back at Alistair. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't a nod of pressure. It was a nod of permission. A nod that said, *, it's okay. Just begin. *, Ilara turned back to the piano. With a breath that shuddered in her throat, she gently lifted the heavy fallboard. It swung back silently, revealing the row upon row of white and black keys. They seemed to stretch out forever, a landscape of possibility and terror. Slowly, she slid her worn backpack from her shoulders and let it rest on the floor beside the piano bench. The action felt deeply personal, like undressing in front of strangers. Then she lowered herself onto the bench. The leather was cool and smooth. She adjusted it slightly, a muscle memory kicking in from a different life. Her back straightened almost of its own accord. She placed her hands in her lap, looking down at them. They were not the hands of a pianist. They were red, chapped from the cold, with small cuts and rough patches. They were the hands of someone who slept in doorways and carried everything they owned. She closed her eyes, trying to shut out the room, the people, the crushing expectation. For a long, agonizing moment, nothing happened. The only sound was the faint hum of a refrigerator from the kitchen. Mr. Thorne shifted his weight, a small sound of impatience. One of the waitstaff coughed softly. In that silence, Ilara stopped fighting. She stopped thinking about the people watching. She stopped thinking about the manager's skepticism or the old man's hope. She stopped thinking about the cold street or the empty stomach. She thought only of the music. Not the notes on a page, but the feeling of it. The story it told. A story of a storm, of a lost love, of a heart breaking and then trying piece by piece to put itself back together. Her right hand lifted. It was no longer trembling. It moved with a certainty that came from a place far deeper than thought. Her index finger extended, and she pressed down on a single key. The note was not loud. It was a deep G, rich and resonant. It hung in the quiet air of the bistro, vibrating a solitary question. Then her left hand joined, building a foundation of low, rolling chords that sounded like distant thunder. They were complex, layered, full of a dark and gathering power. The sound was so big, so professionally and powerfully made, that Mr. Thorne's arms slowly unfolded from his chest. The tired waitstaff stood up straighter, their boredom wiped away. Ilara's eyes were still closed. Her face was a mask of concentration and something else, a deep, profound sorrow. Her hands began to move in earnest now, not in a hesitant exploration, but with the confident, sweeping motions of a master. The opening of Chopin's Ballade, No. 1 unfolded, not as a practiced piece, but as a living emotion. The delicate, singing melody in the right hand wept over the turbulent, stormy chords in the left. It was beauty and pain woven tightly together. The music filled the empty space, bouncing off the upturned chairs and the glass windows. It was no longer just sound. It was a physical presence. You could feel it in your chest. The young waitress with the phone forgot to hide it. She raised it, her thumb finding the record button almost without her thinking, capturing the girl on the bench, the focused old man in the corner, and the manager whose stern face was softening into something like shock. Ilara played. She played through the aching sweetness of the secondary theme, a memory of sunlight. Her fingers flew over runs that cascaded like waterfalls, precise and glittering. She hammered out chords with a power that seemed impossible for her thin frame, the piano trembling under her hands. Then she would pull back to the softest whisper, a single melodic line so fragile and lonely it made the young waiter by the kitchen door look down at his shoes. A strange tightness in his throat. She wasn't performing for them. She was somewhere else entirely. She was in that sunlit room of memory. She was in the long, silent months of grief that followed. She was in every cold night, every silent day, every moment where words had failed her. The music was her voice. It was anger at the unfairness. It was longing for what was lost. It was the stubborn, unkillable hope that still, somehow, lived inside her. Alistair, in his corner, did not move. A single tear traced a path down his weathered cheek, but he didn't wipe it away. He had been right. His old teacher's heart had known. He had heard the stories of prodigies, of talents born in unlikely places, but this was not just talent. This was a soul speaking. This was a person who had lived a deep hurt and had stored it all inside, only to transform it into this heartbreaking beauty. Mr. Thorne was no longer the manager protecting his restaurant. He was just a man, utterly disarmed. The sophisticated background music he was used to was a world away from this raw emotional torrent. He understood, with a sudden, jarring clarity, that he had not just refused a meal to a homeless person. He had tried to usher a genuine artist out of his door. The shame he felt now was hotter and more personal than any he had inflicted. And Alara played on, sailing into the ballad's furious, passionate coda. The music was a whirlwind now, a final, desperate struggle. Her body moved with the force of it, small and fierce on the bench. The final, thunderous chords rang out, one after another, a declaration of survival as much as an ending. Then, silence. A silence that was different from before. It was full. It was ringing with the echo of what had just happened. It was respectful. Ilara's hands fell from the keys into her lap. Her shoulders slumped, all the energy, all the emotion, spent. She was empty. And still, she did not open her eyes. A single tear escaped from beneath her closed lid, cutting a clean path through the dust on her cheek. She simply rested her forehead against the cool, smooth wood of the piano's fallboard, completely unaware of the stunned world she had left behind in the quiet, dark room. The silence after the final chord wasn't empty. It was thick, like the air after a thunderstorm. It held the shape of the music that had just lived in it. No one moved. No one seemed to breathe. The only sound was a soft, shaky sigh from the girl at the piano, her head now resting gently against the instrument, as if listening to its fading heartbeat. Her shoulders rose and fell slowly. She was somewhere far away, in the quiet country the music had left behind Dot in the corner. The old teacher, Alistair, finally blinked. The tear that had traced down his cheek was cool on his skin. He didn't wipe it away. The feeling in his chest was a familiar ache, the one he got only when he witnessed something truly, heartbreakingly pure. It wasn't just the technical skill, though that was staggering, the precision of the runs, the control of the dynamics, the sheer power. It was the story. She hadn't played notes. She had spoken in a language of feeling that everyone in the room, regardless of their knowledge of music, had understood. He saw it in the stunned faces of the young waitstaff. He saw it in the completely transformed face of the manager. Mr. Thorne stood behind the bar, his hands now flat on the polished wood, leaning his weight on them as if he might fall. His mouth was slightly open. All the smooth, professional certainty was gone from his face, replaced by a raw, bewildered shame. He kept looking from the small, exhausted figure at the piano to his own hands, as if seeing them for the first time. He had judged a book by its tattered cover and had been utterly, definitively wrong. The sound that had just filled his restaurant was worth more than 100 meals. 1,000 apologies. The young waitress, her phone still held up but forgotten in her hand, slowly lowered it. She looked at the screen, at the recording she had just taken. It felt sacred now, too private to hold. She glanced at her coworker, who just shook his head slowly. A look of awe on his face, Dot. It was Alistair who moved first. He pushed his chair back slowly, the legs scraping softly on the floor. The sound broke the spell. He didn't clap. Applause felt wrong, too cheap for what they had just witnessed. Instead, he walked slowly toward the piano. Dot, as he walked, his mind, a lifetime devoted to music, filled in the blanks of her story. The music she had chosen told him so much. Chopin's first ballade. It wasn't a cheerful piece. It was a journey through struggle, nostalgia, and a fierce, tumultuous storm of emotion. You didn't play that piece with such understanding from a happy, easy life. He saw a flash, not with his eyes, but with his heart. A different piano. An old, slightly out of tune upright in a modest, sunny living room. A little girl with serious eyes, her feet not touching the floor, frowning in concentration as her small hands struggled to find the right keys. A woman's voice, patient and warm, saying, "Again, from the top, my love. Feel the phrase, don't just play the notes." The image was so clear, it could have been a memory of his own. He knew that beginning. He had taught dozens of children who had started just that way. He stopped a few feet from the piano bench. Alara hadn't moved. She was still lost. Another flash. The same girl, older now, maybe 15. The room is darker. The house is quiet in a way that feels wrong. She sits at the piano, but she doesn't play from a book. Her hands move over the keys, making up slow, mournful chords, searching for a sound that matches the hollow feeling inside her chest. The music from before, the happy scales and cheerful sonatinas, feels like a lie. Now, the only truth is in the minor keys, in the slow, searching melodies. The piano is no longer just a hobby. It is the only place where her grief can live outside her body. Alistair's breath caught. He had seen that, too. The student who returns after a loss, whose music suddenly has a depth and a weight it never did before. A terrible price for artistic growth. He took another quiet step. Mr. Thorne was now coming out from behind the bar, moving as if in a dream. The two waitstaff edged closer, drawn in. The final flashes were murkier, less about music and more about survival. A duffel bag being packed. A sofa in a relative's house that isn't home. Then the sofa is gone. There are bus stations at night, their lights too bright and unfriendly. There are library chairs during the day where she could sit and be invisible and warm. The piano becomes a ghost, a memory that hurts to touch. She passes music schools, hearing the faint, collective sound of practice rooms, and the sound is like a physical pain. She finds a church sometimes, left unlocked during the day, and if she is utterly alone, she might lift the cover on the old piano and play for 5 stolen minutes, her heart pounding the whole time, terrified of being caught. The music becomes a secret, a forbidden thing, tied to a self she used to be, a self that feels like it's fading away. That was the story he had heard. The prodigy whose world fell apart. The artist who didn't stop being an artist, but who had to bury her art just to get through the day. The unbreakable connection between a person and their gift, a connection that not even homelessness could sever. Alara. Alistair said her name softly. It was the first time anyone had spoken since the music ended. She stirred. Slowly, she lifted her head from the piano. She blinked, looking around the dim bistro as if waking from a deep sleep. Her eyes were red-rimmed and clear. She saw the faces looking at her, not with pity, not with impatience, but with a kind of reverent shock. The fear and shame from before were gone from their expressions. They were looking at her, not at her dirty jacket. She looked down at her own hands, resting in her lap. They still looked like her hands, chapped and cold. But they felt different. They felt alive again. They tingled with the memory of the keys. Mr. Thorne was the next to speak. His voice was hoarse, unfamiliar. He began, then stopped. He cleared his throat, tried again. I owe you more than a meal. The words were inadequate, and he knew it. His face crumpled for a second, not into tears, but into a profound regret. I owe you an apology. A real one. Alara just looked at him. The anger she had felt on the park bench was gone, washed away by the music. She felt tired, hollowed out, but clean. The young waitress finally found her voice, holding up her phone slightly. I recorded it. I'm sorry, I should have asked. It was just so beautiful. Do you want me to delete it? Alara looked at the small glowing screen. She saw a glimpse of herself, small on the bench, her face etched with concentration. It was strange, like looking at a stranger. She shook her head slowly. "It's okay," she whispered. Her voice was rough from disuse and emotion. Alistair finally moved closer. He didn't reach out to touch her. He simply stood nearby, a solid, calm presence. "What you just gave us," he said, his own voice thick with feeling, "was a gift. A very rare gift. It came from a deep place. A place of great loss." At the word loss, Elara's eyes finally welled up. She nodded, just once, a sharp little dip of her chin. She didn't cry, but the acknowledgement was there, hanging in the air between them. "The world needs to hear that," Alistair said gently, but with a new firmness. He was no longer just a curious old man. He was a teacher who had found his final, most important student. Not just the music, the person behind it. "You have walked through fire, and you have carried this." He gestured to the piano. "This beautiful, heavy thing through it all. It is time to put down the weight of just surviving. It is time to let your music live again, properly." He turned his pale blue eyes to Mr. Thorne. "We will need a proper meal, please. For the artist." He said the word deliberately, letting it settle in the room. "And then we have much to discuss." Mr. Thorne jumped into action, his managerial instincts returning, but directed now with a fervent desire to make things right. "Of course. Right away. Anything. The kitchen is still warm." He hurried off, calling softly to the waitstaff to set a proper table, to get the best spot by the window. Elara watched the sudden flurry of activity, bewildered. Minutes ago, she was being asked to leave. Now, they were preparing a table for her as if she were a queen. It was too much to take in. She just felt a deep, overwhelming exhaustion. Alistair seemed to understand. "Sit," he said, pulling out a chair from a nearby table. "Just sit. You don't have to do anything else. The hard part is over." And as she sank into the chair, the reality of what had just happened began to settle around her, not as a shock, but as a soft, warm blanket. She had played. She had remembered who she was. And for the first time in a very, very long time, someone had seen her. Not the homeless girl, the pianist, the person. The survivor. Outside, the city night continued, cold and uncaring. But inside the gilded plate, a new story, warm and fragile, was just beginning to be written. The world didn't change all at once. The first change was simple and human. It was a bowl of soup. Mr. Thorne didn't bring it out himself. He seemed to understand that his presence might still be a sharp reminder of the earlier humiliation. Instead, the young waitress carried it over, placing it carefully on the table where Elara sat with the old teacher, Alistair. It wasn't just soup. It was a deep, golden chicken broth with visible herbs, tender pieces of meat, and finely cut vegetables. Steam rose from it, carrying a smell that made Elara's empty stomach clench with a painful kind of hope. Beside it was a basket of warm, crusty bread and a small plate of butter. "Thank you," Elara whispered, her voice still unsteady. She looked at the food, then at the waitress's kind, excited face. "Take your time," the waitress said softly before stepping back, giving them space. Elara picked up the spoon. Her hand shook a little. It felt strange to sit at a proper table, under a soft light, with a meal placed before her. For so long, food had been something functional, eaten quickly out of paper wrappers, often cold. This was different. This was care. She took a sip of the broth. The warmth spread through her chest, a physical comfort so profound it made her eyes sting. She ate slowly, savoring each bite, the simple act feeling sacred. Alistair watched her, saying nothing. He sipped a glass of water, giving her the quiet she needed. He knew this moment was its own kind of medicine. When the bowl was nearly empty, and some color had returned to her cheeks, he spoke. His voice was gentle, but direct. "We must speak of practical things," he said. "Tonight you cannot go back to the park." Alara looked up, a flicker of the old defensiveness in her eyes. It was a reflex. "I have a very boring, very safe guest room," Alistair continued. "It has a door that locks from the inside. It has a bed that is too soft, and a shower with very good water pressure. You would be doing an old man a favor. The house is too quiet. It needs a musician in it, even a sleeping one." He made it sound like a transaction, a favor to him. Alara knew it was charity, but it was offered with such dignity that she couldn't find the will to refuse. The thought of a locked door, a soft bed, a hot shower. It was a fantasy she had stopped allowing herself to have. She gave a single, slow nod. "Good," Alistair said. "That is the first thing. The second thing is that video." The young waitress had shown it to them on her phone. It was shaky, filmed in the dim light, but the audio was startlingly clear. You could hear every nuance of the piano, every whispered phrase and thunderous chord. You could see the intense focus on Alara's face, the shock on Mr. Thorne's, the tear on Alistair's cheek. She asked if she could post it. Alistair said, "I told her the decision was yours, and only yours." Alara stared at the small screen, paused on an image of her at the piano. She looked like a stranger, powerful, connected, alive. "What would happen?" she asked, her voice small. "The truth?" Alistair said, "It would likely be seen by many, many people. The story is compelling. The world has a heart, sometimes, even if it's a fickle one. They would see the artist, not the circumstance. That could bring opportunities. It could also bring a great deal of noise. There is no right answer." Alara thought about the manager's face when he refused her. She thought about all the invisible people like her, passed by on the street every day. She wasn't a symbol, and she didn't want to be a charity case. But if her music could be the thing that made people look twice, that made them see a person instead of a problem, maybe that was worth the noise. "They can post it," she said quietly. The waitress, who had been pretending to wipe a nearby table, lit up. "I'll make sure it's okay with Mr. Thorne, too," she said, before rushing off. The third thing was the future. As they sat in the quiet bistro, Alistair laid out no grand promises. He spoke of steps. A safe place to sleep, first and always. Then a doctor, just a checkup. "We must look after the instrument," he said, meaning her. Then, if she wished, she could play his piano. A beautiful, well-tuned grand that sat in his quiet living room, mostly unused. "It is lonely, too," he said. He mentioned names of people he knew, not as famous people, but as a woman who runs a music school, and a man who fixes up old instruments, and sometimes finds students part-time work, tuning them. There were no guarantees, only pathways. For the first time in years, Alara saw a path that didn't lead to a dead end or a cold bench. Mr. Thorne approached as they were preparing to leave. He held a small sealed envelope. He looked directly at Alara, his earlier shame replaced by a solemn respect. "This is not payment," he said firmly. "Music like that cannot be paid for. This is back pay for the work you offered to do tonight. A fair wage for a fair trade." He placed the envelope on the table. It was clearly more than the cost of a few dishes washed, but the way he framed it allowed her to accept it without feeling like a beggar. It was clever and kind. Alara looked at it, then up at him. "Thank you," she said. And she meant it. The video was posted just before midnight. The waitress wrote a simple caption with what she knew. "Tonight a girl came into the restaurant where I work. She was cold and hungry and asked to work for food. My manager said no. Later, an old customer asked her to play our silent piano. This is what happened. Her name is Alara. The world did what the world does. The story was too potent to ignore. It spread, not like a wildfire, but like a slow, rising tide. People shared it because of the stunning music. They shared it because of the dramatic turn, the refusal, then the astonishing performance. They shared it because it made them feel something. Shame, hope, wonder. By the next afternoon, it had reached people who could actually do something. The inbox of the restaurant's social media page flooded with messages. Not just from viewers, but from the woman who ran the city's most prestigious music conservatory, who had been a student of Alistair's 40 years prior. From the owner of a local piano dealership, offering a proper instrument for her to practice on. From a kind-faced woman who ran a nonprofit that helped young artists in crisis with housing and grants. Alistair fielded these inquiries from his cozy, book-lined study. He acted as a gatekeeper, shielding Alara from the overwhelming tide. He set up meetings, not with talk show producers looking for a ratings boost, but with the practical people who could build a foundation. The music school offered a full scholarship and a stipend for living expenses, contingent on her passing an audition, a formality, they said, after the video. The nonprofit offered a small, clean apartment in a quiet building, with a 6-month rent grant to give her stability. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. It was the beginning of a very hard, real journey. Alara moved into the apartment. It felt vast and empty and terrifyingly quiet. The first night, she lay on the bed, unable to sleep, missing the familiar, cramped safety of her backpack. Progress was not a straight line. There were days of crushing anxiety, where the pressure of expectation felt like a mountain on her chest. She had to learn to eat regularly, to sleep in a bed, to trust that the door would still be hers tomorrow. But there was the piano. Alistair's piano, and then a loaned one in her own apartment. At first, she could only play for minutes at a time, the emotions too raw. But slowly, the music became a companion again, not just a conduit for pain. She practiced scales. She learned new pieces. She even, tentatively, began to compose little melodies of her own, snippets of music that sounded not like stormy Chopin, but like tentative, morning light. The old teacher came by several times a week. Their lessons were not always about music. Sometimes they drank tea and talked about nothing. Sometimes she played, and he would simply listen, then say 1 or 2 words. Softer here, or that phrase is a question. Let it breathe. He was rebuilding not just a pianist, but a person. Weeks later, a formal, intimate audition was held at the conservatory for a small panel. Alara played the ballade again. This time, in a proper hall, on a magnificent piano, the music was even more powerful. It was no longer just a cry of pain. It was a testament of survival. She finished to silence, then to the soft, sincere applause of 5 professors who had all, at some point, wiped their eyes. Afterwards, the head of the school, the woman who had known Alistair, took her hands. "Welcome home, my dear," she said. The world's attention eventually moved on, as it always does, to the next story. But Alara's story was just beginning. She was not an overnight sensation. She was a student. She was a person healing. She had bad days and good days. But she was seen, and she was safe, and she had her music back. One evening, she sat at the piano in her own little apartment. The streetlights glowed outside her window. She played a simple, peaceful piece by Bach. It was orderly, mathematical, a beautiful structure to hold her steady. As the last note faded, she smiled, a small, private thing. She was not the homeless girl who played the piano. She was Alara, who had come home. And her song, after so long a silence, was just beginning.